Just before 11 a.m. on July 7th, 1920, three former convicts entered the Farmers State Bank in the small village of Grass Lake, Michigan, armed with handguns, while a fourth accomplice remained in their getaway vehicle. The first intruder through the door advanced towards the cashier's area and instructed the two bank employees, cashier Floyd Mellencamp and assistant cashier Harry Knight, to raise their hands above their heads. Simultaneously, the second intruder directed the bank's two customers to do the same. All four individuals were then ushered to a rear corner of the bank and instructed to face the wall. Subsequently, their hands were bound behind their backs using fishing line, and they were confined to a restroom, which was then securely locked. With the bank now under their control, the three robbers meticulously combed through the vault, collecting all available currency, including security bonds. They augmented their haul with $1,300 in gold and silver coins. The trio then exited the bank through the front door and entered their waiting getaway car. They proceeded to drive approximately 6 miles south to the Mack Island Hotel on Wolf Lake, where they divided the stolen proceeds among themselves. A short while after the robbers had made their hasty exit from town, the bank's president entered the premises and was immediately struck by the unusual silence and absence of both employees and customers. He soon stumbled upon the four individuals confined in the restroom. He promptly contacted the sheriff for assistance. As word spread throughout the village, several vigilante groups formed, but quickly gave up the search when they were unable to find any trace of the bandits. Meanwhile, at Sheriff Ed Larrabee's office in Jackson, Under Sheriff Harry Worden received the urgent call from the bank president. Worden was joined by Deputy Sheriffs Verl Cutt and Van Loomis, along with the state food inspector and Herman Hawk, a local Essex motorcar salesman. Worden wasted no time and immediately enlisted Hawk's help, requesting the use of his fastest Essex automobile. Hawk willingly offered to drive, and as they hastily departed the office, the state food inspector mentioned rumors of bootleggers frequenting the Mack Island Hotel. Upon arrival at the bank, the deputies encountered scant evidence, with only a vague description of the robbers to work with. The four individuals who had been trapped in the bank provided some details. All three assailants were of shorter stature and had stocky builds. One of them was notably wearing automobile goggles, which made his identification even more challenging. Additionally, all three appeared to be in their 40s. Someone in the vicinity mentioned having spotted a Buick 6 parked in front of the bank around the time of the robbery. Under Sheriff Worden observed that the robbers had employed green fishing cord to bind the witnesses, and he discovered a distinctive piece of this line on the bank floor. This line notably differed from the local fishing equipment typically used in the area. Coupled with the reports of unfamiliar individuals lodging at the Mack Island Hotel, this prompted Officer Worden, Deputy Cutt, and a small group of armed men to head toward Wolf Lake to investigate further. Upon reaching the lake, their initial encounter was with Lester Bacon, who was reclining in a hammock. Worden was aware of Bacon's criminal history, engaged in a brief conversation with him, and moved on. Little did they know that Bacon had served as the gang's lookout while they divided the stolen money. Suspicion arose when Bacon claimed he had not ventured anywhere that day, yet his car's radiator was still noticeably hot to the touch. Continuing their inquiries, the deputies approached W.K. McIntyre, the proprietor of the Mack Island Hotel, and inquired about the guests staying at his establishment. After a brief discussion, McIntyre led them to a tenant house situated a short distance from the hotel. Worden and Cutt ascended to the second-floor veranda, accompanied by McIntyre. Upon reaching the last door at the end of the veranda, McIntyre knocked on it, informing those inside that there were visitors waiting. Officer Worden pushed McIntyre aside and waited, sensing that something was amiss. Following some commotion from within the room, a man later identified as Wee Harris emerged and closed the door behind him. He informed the lawman that disrobed women were present in the room. Worden replied that they would wait until the women left before entering. Deputy Cutt, however, interjected, stating, "No, Harry, we won't wait." Harris abruptly turned around, pushed open the door, and yelled, "Are you all set?" The room erupted in gunfire, and bullets flew through the open doorway. Under Sheriff Worden was struck by 2 bullets and fell, severely wounded. Deputy Cutt grappled with Harris, attempting to wrestle him to the floor, but neither gained the upper hand as they careened around the screened-in porch on the second floor. They eventually tumbled in front of the open door, and another volley of shots emanated from the room. A bullet grazed Deputy Sheriff Cutt's scalp, causing profuse bleeding. Simultaneously, someone inside the room fired a shot through the window, narrowly missing Mr. McIntyre. Locked in their struggle, Harris and Cutt rolled down the veranda's staircase. At the foot of the stairs, Deputy Loomis awaited an opportunity and then struck Harris on the head with the butt of his pistol. Finally subdued, Harris was placed in handcuffs. Amid what had evolved into a fierce gunfight, Deputy Loomis cautiously ascended the now blood-stained veranda stairs toward the room. However, he was met with a barrage of bullets from the firearm wielded by Walter Wilson. Loomis instinctively sought cover and returned fire blindly. Exhausting his pistol's ammunition, he charged up the staircase, discovering that 5 out of 6 shots had found their mark on Wilson, including wounds to the leg and groin. Despite his severe injuries, Wilson, upon seeing the advancing deputy, attempted to bring his weapon to bear and pulled the trigger. Wilson was unable to fire a shot as he suddenly lost consciousness. Within the room, the other 2 men, known as Doc Stowe and Dan Rosenberg, wisely refrained from stepping onto the veranda amid the ferocious firefight that had taken Wilson down. Instead, they opted for an escape through the room's rear window, leaping to the ground below. Rosenberg landed safely and made a run for it, while Stowe suffered a less fortunate fate, breaking his leg upon impact. Nonetheless, he managed to hobble and crawl toward the swamp at the property's edge, where he concealed himself within the tall grass, hoping to evade detection. After handcuffing Harris, Deputy Cutt disarmed the bandit and began leading him toward the hotel. Along the way, he encountered Henry Haig from Jackson, who had been vacationing at the resort. Haig, likely shaken by the intense gunfire and the sight of blood flowing from the deputy's head wound, was astonished to find the very man he had seen around the hotel in recent days, and with whom he had likely engaged in social conversation, now being led his way in handcuffs. His surprise deepened when Deputy Cutt asked him to keep an eye on the prisoner while he entered the hotel to call for backup. Upon Cutt's return from the hotel, he spotted another man whom he immediately assumed to be a gang member, given the handgun protruding from his pocket. Already battered and bloodied, Officer Cutt lunged at the man, later identified as George Comfort, and engaged in a struggle to prevent him from extracting the revolver from his pants. The altercation spilled across the yard, with neither gaining the upper hand. Mr. Haig, who had taken Harris down to the lake to wash his face, rushed to help Officer Cutt, and along with Mr. McIntyre, eventually subdued Comfort and disarmed him. Meanwhile, Dan Rosenberg had fled the hotel, sprinting down the road to escape the scene, but he was apprehended by a deputy sheriff en route. Lester Bacon, the 6th member of the gang, remained on the hotel lawn until authorities took him into custody. Left unattended by his civilian guard, Harris, still in handcuffs, seized an opportunity to make a break for the swamp, disappearing into the dense, watery foliage. Jackson County Sheriff Larrabee had been away from the office when the initial call came in, reporting the bank robbery. The sheriff, accompanied by Deputy Sheriff Miller and Coroner Harry Mills, made their way to the bank, but arrived after Under Sheriff Worden and Deputy Cutt had already left for Wolf Lake. The trio conducted a thorough examination of the bank and were en route back to Jackson when their vehicle was halted by a pedestrian, and they received the grim news of a murder at Wolf Lake. They hastened toward the Mack Island Hotel and were greeted by a scene inundated with police personnel and armed volunteers. Upon being informed of Under Sheriff Worden's tragic demise, the sheriff's emotions threatened to overwhelm him, yet he summoned the strength to set aside his grief when he learned that 2 of the robbers were still on the loose. With the strong belief that the remaining criminals were likely concealed within the swamp, the sheriff swiftly organized the armed volunteers and deputies, tasking them with scouring the perimeters of the wetlands. When they reached the area where it was suspected that Stowe might be hiding, the sheriff directed several men to cut loose with their weapons. The barrage of bullets and buckshot quickly threw Stowe into a state of panic, prompting him to emerge from his concealment and surrender. During a brief break following Stowe's capture, Sheriff Larrabee approached the tenant house and ascended the stairs to the second-floor veranda. With tears streaming down his face, he knelt beside the lifeless body of Under Sheriff Worden. After a few moments, he rose, and Worden's remains were carefully lifted from the veranda, then transported to his home. Walter Wilson, who lay nearby in considerable pain, and James Stowe, with his leg bandaged, both refrained from looking at Worden's body as it was respectfully carried away from the veranda. Throughout the relentless pursuit of Stowe, men from the surrounding area continued to converge on the Mack Island Hotel, armed and eager to assist in any way possible. Even the warden of Jackson State Prison arrived with 20 well-armed men carrying high-powered rifles, expressing his readiness to offer support. The sheriff found himself with a substantial force, capable of encircling the entire swamp, which they promptly did. Groups of volunteers were dispatched to traverse the wetlands, hoping to flush out Harris. However, this strategy failed to yield results. Frustrated but undeterred, the sheriff ordered the posse to empty their firearms into the marsh, aiming to intimidate Harris into surrendering. Regrettably, this approach proved ineffective. Captain Percy Taylor, a seasoned World War I officer with combat experience, approached Sheriff Larrabee with an alternate plan. With the sheriff's consent, Taylor organized the men into a long skirmish line spanning the entire width of the swamp. He issued the order to advance, and the skirmish line plunged into the swamp, trudging through dense thickets, wading waist-deep in water, and slogging through clinging mud, all while maintaining their formation. As the line moved beyond a barbed wire fence marking the halfway point, several men caught sight of Harris amidst a clump of marsh grass. The fugitive, realizing the odds were against him, attempted to raise his still manacled hands and surrendered. By the time Harris was apprehended, Comfort, Bacon, Rosenberg, Stowe, and Wilson had already been transported to Jackson. The sheriff escorted the last of the culprits to the room where the bank robbers had been lodging at the hotel. Harris, with a blood-stained shirt, visibly exhausted and seemingly relieved, accepted a cigarette from his captors. Following a brief interrogation, the sheriff directed Harris to join his fellow criminals in jail. Throughout Thursday night, the police maintained a vigilant perimeter around the jail, with an officer constantly stationed in the gang's cell block, ready to thwart any escape attempts. On Thursday night, Harris confessed to the bank robbery, and once he started talking, he couldn't seem to stop. Harris admitted that he, along with Wilson and Rosenberg, had been residing at the Mack Island Hotel for several weeks, with Stowe only recently joining them. They had successfully integrated with the affluent vacationers of Jackson County, portraying themselves as prosperous businessmen, although the nature of their business remained unquestioned. Harris confessed, "We believed that no one would suspect us at Mack Island. We thought we would blend in as hotel guests. That's why we chose to divide the money in the tenant house rather than our hotel rooms." Harris added that Lester Bacon and George Comfort, the locals within the gang, had meticulously scouted the Farmers State Bank even before the arrival of the rest of the gang. They had convincingly persuaded the other 4 bank robbers that the Mack Hotel on Wolf Lake was the ideal rendezvous point before and after the robbery. These 2 likely had drafted plans for the heist and presented them to Doc Stowe, who became an integral part of the scheme. With the bank robbers securely in jail, an extensive investigation into all aspects of the robbery and the tragic death of Under-Sheriff Worden was launched. Early on Friday morning, Warden Hulbert from Jackson State Prison arrived with a record clerk and a fingerprint expert to participate in the questioning of the robbers at the county jail. Fingerprint analysis and interrogation swiftly revealed that 3 of the gang members had prior criminal records. Wilson, known under 2 aliases, had served sentences in Indiana and Illinois for highway robbery. Comfort had an extensive criminal history, having served multiple sentences, and Stowe had spent 8 years in prison, being free for just over a year. Although none of them admitted to shooting Under-Sheriff Worden, the police suspected Rosenberg as the one who had pulled the trigger. The sheriff appealed to the public, requesting that anyone who came across items related to the robbery bring them to the jail. While all the paper currency and securities had been recovered at the hotel, 2 revolvers belonging to the gang members, as well as a quantity of gold and silver coins, remained missing. On Saturday, Wilson underwent surgery to remove several bullets, while Stowe went to the hospital for a dressing change on his broken leg and was subsequently returned to the jail. However, there were no significant developments in the case, except for an incident that left the sheriff both perplexed and annoyed. Around noon on Saturday, a man from a nearby restaurant delivered 6 well-prepared dinners in baskets for the 6 gangsters. Each meal included roast beef, mashed potatoes, gravy, fresh tomatoes, onions, bread, butter, and coffee. Additionally, each basket contained tobacco and rolling papers. When questioned, the delivery man stated that a woman had placed the order for the prisoners. Reluctantly, the sheriff allowed the prisoners to enjoy the catered meal, but sought to identify the woman who had ordered it. Unfortunately, her identity remained a mystery, though it was likely Walter Wilson's wife, who had arrived in Jackson on Friday but was denied access to her husband unless he was on the brink of death due to his wounds. The Pennsylvania police identified Wee Harris as wanted for bank robbery in their state, as well as for jumping bail on a $10,000 bond related to another bank robbery and involvement in illegal whiskey activities. Harris had a long history of criminal pursuits, with a total of 24 arrests to his name. Dave Rosenberg was wanted in Pennsylvania for murder, and the sheriff was looking into the possibility that Rosenberg faced a similar charge in Chicago. Walter Wilson had previously served a 5-year sentence in a Missouri penitentiary and had been arrested in Chicago for burglary. On November 9, 1921, Doc Stowe, W.E. Harris, and Galinsky, Rosenberg's real name, received double life sentences. Despite repeated appeals for their parole, their pleas were denied. One judge on an appeal board poignantly remarked that Harry Worden was still dead. Harris passed away in prison in 1952 at the age of 72. Comfort and Bacon received sentences of 15, 30 years and 10, 20 years respectively, with Comfort ultimately dying in prison. Bacon was the sole robber to be granted parole. When Wilson had sufficiently recovered to attend court, he too was sentenced to double life terms. An enduring mystery surrounds the unaccounted-for $1,500 in gold and silver coins, believed to have been buried somewhere near the now-demolished Tennant House. This missing loot has garnered attention on various internet websites that catalog lost treasures. Additionally, the fate of the 2 revolvers discarded or dropped by the robbers remains unknown. Under Sheriff Harry Worden left behind a family consisting of his wife and 3 children, a young boy aged 2 and 2 girls aged 5 and 7. His wife was in poor health, prompting the formation of a committee to raise funds for the family's support. According to Deputy Sheriff Walter Mayer, a close friend of Worden's, the undersheriff had an unsettling premonition of his impending death. Approximately a week prior to the bank robbery, he confided in Mayer, expressing a strong sense that he would meet a sudden and untimely end. In light of this foreboding, Worden entrusted Mayer with a crucial task, in the event of his demise, to ensure that his leather wallet found its way to his wife. Worden disclosed that the wallet contained important documents he wished his wife to have. He also mentioned that he had recently attempted to acquire additional life insurance, but his application had been denied by the insurance company. Funeral services for Undersheriff Worden were conducted on a somber Sunday at 2 p.m., held in the Worden residence. The Bankers Association had extended a generous $5,000 reward for the capture of the Farmer State Bank robbers, and both deputies Cutt and Loomis were entitled to a share of this reward for their heroic efforts in apprehending the 6 men. Remarkably, both deputies declined to accept any monetary compensation and requested that Worden's widow be the recipient of their respective shares, demonstrating a heartfelt tribute to their fallen colleague.